Hi, everybody. Welcome to BIO113. This week we're going to talk about evolution and natural selection. And I like this cartoon because it shows the woman and the man running from the bear. And basically she says, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. So it's survival of the fittest. Okay. Um, so let's get into evolution by natural selection. Uh, Basically, evolution within a population is the thing that keeps that population alive, being able to adapt to your environment. Uh, One thing you have to keep in mind is that evolution is a change over a long period of time, and it happens to a population as a whole, not to an individual. Okay. All right. And there's many factors that contribute to this evolutionary change, uh, such as mutations, natural mutations that occur, natural selection, or uh, genetic information coming in to the brought into the population and things like that. All right, so and we talk about evolution, and in biology, we've talked. Our scientists have basically been able to trace uh, descent for all living things from a common ancestor, uh, as best we could tell, based on genetic information that we have, and we'll talk some about that in a little bit. But I wanted to say, over a long period of time is when you have evolution occur. So you can't expect to see something evolve in, necessarily one lifetime. It might take several lifetimes for evolution to occur. And you can see, if you chart out these changes that occur, you can see divergent in the path along the way, and branching of the different life forms to be arranged in what we call like a tree of life. Okay, so we'll cover all that in a minute. So originally, uh, living organisms were classified by a system that grouped them together based on basically different characteristics they had, either maybe similar hands or body structure, the way they take up nutrition and use it, or how they develop and reproduce, things like that. And we used this genus species to name things, so everything had a genus and a species. And everything is grouped into 5 kingdoms, and this is still the case today. You've got bacteria, you've got, and blue-green algae are in the one area. You've got protists, which are single-celled eukaryotes, single-celled eukaryotes, fungi, plants, and animals. We, of course, are in the animal group. All right, so the new scheme, though, of our classifications that we have is based on genetic information. So now that we know and we're able to sequence the genomes of all different living organisms, we can actually compare those, line those up and compare side by side the sequence of these genomes, and get a better feel of how things are related in that aspect. And it talks here about using ribosomes. One of the reasons you use ribosomes for comparison, their DNA, is because all living things have those, and it's a short piece of DNA that you can see, if there's changes, as opposed to, every living organism has a different size genome. And so you can't really compare side by side a human genome, complete genome, to, say, a mushroom, because it's just not going to line up. But they both have inside their cells these ribosomes that they initially based this on, so they could compare these guys side by side. And you can see where there's things that are conserved or the same, or things that are diverge, that are different. All right, so we've lumped it now into three main domains. You got prokaryotes, which includes domain bacteria, and domain archaea, which is these extreme bacteria. And then the third domain under eukaryotes is domain eukaryota. And this is protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Okay. All right. I promise this won't be as dry as it's been. But so scientists arrange these organisms into what we call a tree. You can see here on the left, we've got, you have a little branch coming off, and you've got A, and then you have a common ancestor between A and B and C here. And so the branching occurs. And then for B and C, same thing, common ancestor between B and C in this little green square. And then the C line, or each line, is the unique ancestor of this animal C. And you can see that over here on the right, how they've represented it. Each one of these lines represents an event that happened at some point in time. Now, you got to keep in mind, if it says all of a sudden we have a speciation event here of vertebrate being seen in animals, this is a huge, long period of time before you go from no vertebrae to having a, vertebrate. So it's a gradual process. And, most of our records here are based on fossil records. So it has to have a lot of information to get to this point and to figure out these events that occur. But basically, this shows you how they would build what we call a phylogenetic tree, okay? And how you can see how things are related. So sharks and birds were related, but only back here at the beginning point where, we had the vertebrae show up and they're still related. And then at that point, they branched off and you went to having a bony skeleton, or sharks in their case have no bony skeleton. So that's how they would set up the tree. Okay, so homologous structures are something that we use to look at between animals to determine similarity, and or differences. And homologous structures just mean structures that are very similar. So believe it or not, the fin of a shark or a whale is very similar to a human hand, especially in a whale. To a human hand, if you had side by side the bones, you could kind of pick out the same bones in each of those. And so you can see that they may have been related, back at a common ancestor. In contrast to that are analogous structures, means these guys were not the same. So they weren't from a common ancestor. So they may perform the same function, but they are not from the same ancestors. So they may have been independently developed to perform a similar function, okay? So if you compare a bird and a bat, this is a good example, and they both have wings, and the wings both do the same thing, keep them in the air, but they're not made alike each other at all. They both developed the wings, but they both developed them separate from each other, so they wouldn't have a common ancestor that had the same kind of wings, because they both have different kinds of wings, okay? So that's analogous structures. All right, so we talked about briefly just looking at the sequence comparisons of DNA used to identify and classify organisms. And so I talked about this ribosomal RNA sequence they got here. This little R stands for ribosomal. So you can see here we've got a human, a yeast, and corn, okay? And these three things are eukaryotic, all right? Then we've got the prokaryotics, which are in red and purple. So you can just draw a line after corn, and you have different organisms here all on the left, but the divider here between corn and E. coli, Escherichia coli, which is shorthand E. coli, is a bacteria. So that's a dividing line between the two domains, or prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. But you can see when you get the sequence of all these things, everything that's in blue on here is exactly shared between all these organisms. So every organism, we're talking about specific base pairs along the way, but you can see a clear where you have the same sequence in all these organisms. So you can see how you could figure out that they were related at some point back in history. Now, everywhere you see yellow here, this means this is more of a eukaryotic-like sequence, even though, or base pair, even though you see some of these C's here in the prokaryotic kingdom. You've got the eukaryotic having most of these. Now, you can see the red here. Most of these stay down in the prokaryotic area, E. coli and below, but you still have some of the red here jumping up into some of the eukaryotic organisms. So you can see that they're related, and you can figure out along the way, if you figure out how many base pairs they have related, you can figure out how closely related they are. And at the bottom here, it shows you what we call consensus sequence. So if you go through and pick out basically the most common base pair at each one of these spots, you get a sequence like this. Now you'll see some X's in here. That just means that there was no dominant base pair there, okay? So, DNA is A, T, G, and C, right? So anywhere they had common ones, they put them in here. If there was mostly one, they put it in a certain color, mostly the other, it's another color. And then you have the X, where it's like, at that particular base pair, we don't have a dominant one. So this is really just to show you that we can use the DNA sequences of these organisms to show how related they are and how they may have come from a common ancestor. Okay, so let's talk about this guy Darwin briefly. He did a lot of research and came up with these 4 kind of rules or postulates, he called them, of evolution by natural selection. So for evolution to take place via natural selection, mind you, you have to have 4 things. You have to have individuals within a species that have differences. Okay, so this is something that you will see in any population. There's going to be differences among individuals. And if you have a difference in the individual's ability to survive and reproduce, you have to have that too. So these variations may increase or decrease an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. And some of these variations get passed on to the offspring. So basically here meaning genetically based variations, right? And the individuals with the most favorable adaptations are more likely to survive and reproduce. And so you see over a long period of time, if you have a more favorable trait or adaptation, then you might be favored to as a, if in animals, you might be favored as a mate, and then your offspring might continue that favorable adaptation. They would get favored as mate over others. And you can see why, this particular trait might increase in the population overall. All right, so now not every population is evolving. You do have populations that have basically come to an equilibrium. And if you look at an organism such as horseshoe crab is a great example. These things haven't changed in millions of years. They basically got to a point where they didn't need to change anymore. They are able to live in the environment they live in and don't need, and there's no traits that are occurring that are changing any of their ability to survive and reproduce as individuals. So for this to take place, though, the population has to be really large, and the individuals can mate with each other without limitation, so they don't limit themselves to, say, one mate, maybe. There's not selection of different alleles, so there's very little difference between the traits of individuals, then you're not going to be picking one trait over another. no gene migration, meaning you don't have a different population come in and join your population and bring their own genes with them, and no mutations, or mutations are just simple little mutations. And you can see this in certain populations, but this is not very common at all in nature. All right, so here's an example of evolution by natural selection. You've got some beetles that are a population of beetles. Some of them are green and some of them are brown, okay? And let's say in this environment is mostly a dirt environment. There's not a lot of grass here. And so in this environment, the green beetles can't survive as well as the brown ones, because birds can see them easier. And it's not like birds are only going to eat the green ones, but if it's easier to see the green ones, you're going to pick those up first, right? And so birds would come in and eat more green beetles than they would brown beetles. So since the brown color is something that can be inherited, you end up with more brown beetle babies being produced, right? And so more brown beetles in the population. And in this case, the brown color is an advantageous trait. And over time, it causes the population to change to a higher portion of brown. Now, that's over a long, long period of time, if you had the same, you know, selection against green, you may get rid of the green gene completely, but most likely you're just changing the proportion of brown to green beetles in a short term, okay? And, you know, that's advantageous because this environment could change. You could, you know, let's say rain came and grass grew and the green beetles had a better environment to survive in. Well, then the brown beetles will be easier to see by the birds, so they get eaten. So it's not about eliminating traits or eliminating these different traits. It's about percentage of the population or portion of the population that has the trait kind of leads the population in a certain direction. Now, again, it's all dependent on environment, okay? The environment you live in can affect whether your ability to survive, basically, from predators or things like that. All right, so variation is key as well. Like I said, you have to have variation in a population to see any evolution occur. And variation basically is just a difference in a characteristic, okay? These can be caused by mutations, which happen all the time in DNA. And you get maybe a single mutation can occur. And you have your cells in all living things have, most living things have cellular machinery basically to fix mistakes when it makes copies of the DNA, but it can't fix all the mistakes. And therefore, mutations are allowed to be passed on to offspring. Usually, a single mutation doesn't have as much effect as multiple mutations occurring. So if you had a mutation in a gene for the green beetles, let's say, if there's a mutation that caused them to be brown instead, then that's a variation in the population, right? So gene flow is another one we talked briefly. I mentioned gene flow earlier, and then basically you can think of gene flow as migration. So if you have, let's say you have a pond that has a population of geese, and 100 miles away, there's another pond with a population of geese, and these guys have been living in each pond by themselves for a long time. They have their own set of genes. And let's say the one pond dries up, so those geese fly away until they find another pond. So they bring all their genes with them when they come join this second, this first population of geese or whatever. So that's gene flow. They're bringing their genes into and joining another population, okay? And then, of course, sexual reproduction. You can get new gene combinations. I don't know if you remember when we talked about meiosis, where we had that crossing over event sometimes of the chromosomes, where a piece of like the chromosome from the mother will get cut off and put on the father's chromosome and vice versa. And so That's a new gene combination occurring right there via sexual reproduction, as well as, the father has his own set of genes he supplies, while the mother has her own set of genes, and those two combine to form, a new trait or in the population, right? Okay. So fitness, let's talk about fitness. A lot of times people confuse fitness with, the exercise fitness that you hear a lot of people talk about. In nature or in science, fitness basically refers to an organism's ability to survive and reproduce offspring that are capable of reproducing. If you produce 100 offspring and none of them can reproduce, then you're not very fit in a scientific or natural environment. It also includes things like surviving, mate finding, and reproduction. Okay, and totally dependent on your environment. So let's take a look at the white rabbit here on the left. These rabbits have an adaptation that allows them to change their fur color in wintertime so that they blend in with the snow to avoid predators. In summertime, they may be brown, but when winter comes, if they live in a high snow area and they turn white, they're going to blend in with snow a lot better to evade predators. Penguins, the middle picture here, penguins put a lot of time and energy into parental care because they only have like one offspring. Sometimes they have two, but usually it's just one. And so, the parents will go months without eating just to provide a lot of parental care. One of the parents will, while the other one goes out and eats. Provide this parental care to help their young survive. So they don't need a lot of offspring. They just need one to take care of really well. All right. So that's an adaptation they have. Okay. Adaptations aren't always physical, like manifestations. They can be behavioral as well. So on the right here, we've got the peacock. And basically, this is all about finding a mate. So the more brilliant the peacock looks, the more chances are he's going to find a mate, someone that picks him, because they're attracted to him. If you ever get a chance to look up bird of paradise, these things, there's so many different varieties of these, but they have the most elaborate feathers and crazy looking things you've ever seen, and then do these weird dances. And that's all about attracting a mate. Okay, so, all right, so you've heard me talk about adaptation. And as I said, adaptation, this is the characteristic that can increase your fitness. So if like with the penguins, they have the behavioral adaptation that increases their fitness, their ability to survive and reproduce. Okay, something that allows you to evade predators, like the katydid down here. This particular katydid, it looks like a leaf. Now, I had a student once tell me there's no way that happened naturally, and I got to remind everybody, an adaptation like this doesn't just happen overnight. This is a long period of time. You've got predators selecting for the easiest to find bugs, right? So if you happen to have a mutation that allows you to blend in just a little bit more with the environment you're in, you're more likely to survive and pass those genes on. And over time, as mutations occur, if you eventually have a mutation that looks like this, a bird's going to think you're a leaf and not eat you at all. So you can see how, the predators help select. So the environment helps select for the different traits to come about, the adaptations to come about. It's not just the individual wanting the adaptation. The environment helps to select for these adaptations by picking the things that are easier to see, thus allowing the ones with the best adaptation to survive, right? Another type of adaptation is this creosote bush. These guys actually have toxin they produce so that nothing can grow near where they are, because they grow in like a very arid, dry environment. They need all the nutrients they can get. So they basically make a toxic environment around them so that no other weeds or anything can steal any nutrients that they want. Okay. Anatomical feature, like with the bat and using echolocation, that's a great adaptation these animals have that allows them to be able to find prey without being able to see. they use echolocation. All right. Those are all adaptations that have developed over time. Let's look at the bat and imagine if you have, let's just assume they have some sort of echolocation to begin at the point we're starting at. And if you have one that has better echolocation than another, he's more likely to find insects and things like that. So you can see where he'd be more likely to survive and reproduce. Thus, his fitness is increased, right? All right, so keep in mind, as I said, only this evolution by natural selection only occurs if you can, or there are traits that can be passed on genetically, are inheritable, and they make a difference in fitness. You can have mutations, you do have mutations occur in your cells that may not make a difference at all. And so those mutations may not be selected for at all by nature. And in reality, this thing, natural selection is very slow and takes many, many, many generations for you to see the effect take place. It's occurring the whole time, but it's very slow. It takes a generation each time. Once you're born with the mutations that you have, let's say, or the genes pool that you have, and you're not going to change anymore. But let's say you have a mutation occur in your reproductive cells that you can pass on to your offspring, or the mutation you inherited from your parents gets passed to your offspring. So you can see it takes many generations for these mutations to be selected for by nature. And it's just, something that allows you to survive better, basically, and reproduce. So evolution changes the frequency of the alleles in the population as a whole. So it changes, and if you have evolution occurring, you're going to have an increase in this favorable trait in the population as a whole, but not the individual level. Like I said, evolution doesn't happen to individuals, it happens to populations as a whole. Okay, it's kind of a hard concept to grasp, but just try to think in big terms, right? And of course, natural selection, being natural, is dependent on the environment. You can have different populations of the same. You can take one population of insects and split them up and put them in two different environments. And let's say you're able to watch these insects over, 20 years. If you looked at them after that much time, they've had multiple generations occur, you will see, depending on the environment they're each in, you may see a difference in the two populations, even though they started from a common point and they have diverged based on their environment. Okay. All right. So that is all of the lecture I have for today. I did want to talk a little bit about the homework I have for this time. Let me see if I can bring that up here. All right. So let me see if I can make this large. All right. So, as before, there's this big long thing talking about everything we just talked about. But when you get to the homework, this homework isn't as, I would say this homework's easier than in the past. There's only 9 questions I want answers to, and you can just type them up if you want. But let's talk about the first one here. Okay, so we've got a scenario here. We've got a bunch of mice living in a, gray environment, and you've got white mice and gray mice. And you've got predators in part 2 here. You've got predators that come along. Who are the predators going to pick out? The easiest thing to grab is the white mice because they're easiest to see. So they grab a white mouse. You can see a nice little mouse and its talons there. And so over time, you can see the number of white mice that are in the population has decreased, and the number of gray mice has, the percentage of the population that's gray has increased, right? So it went from being 50-50 to 20% white, 80% gray, okay? And it's just a very basic, much like the example of the beetles, it's a very basic example of evolution by natural selection. So these gray mice had an adaptation, a characteristic that increased their fitness in this environment because they were harder for predators to find, right? So that increased their ability to survive and reproduce. And so that's what the first question is here. Which characteristic was the adaptation that increased their fitness? Well, the coat color was matched the environment, so that allowed them to hide. I do want to talk about number 2 here just briefly. So I've got a table here, and I've got on the first column, we're talking about characteristics of each mouse. So this is a table with 4 female mice that live in a beach area, which mostly tan sand with scattered plants. So it's a different scenario than the first thing here. And we've got the characteristics listed over here. We've got running speed, number of pups they produce, and the age at which they die. And also we've got color of the fur. So we picked 4 different colors. So we've got a black mouse who can go 8 centimeters per second, had 0 offspring, and lived for 2 months. Right from the very start, we can say this mouse was not fit enough because it had 0 offspring, and fitness is all about the ability to survive and reproduce, not to mention it only survived for 2 months. Okay. So let's look at the tan mouse. And you can tell this running speed, it may affect fitness a little bit, but it's not in the definition we're looking for. It doesn't make a difference. You can kind of toss this stat out because it's not what we're looking for with fitness here is the ability to survive and reproduce offspring that are capable of reproducing. So again, with the cream mouse here, 0 offspring, throw that guy out. So the black and the cream are out. So now between the tan and the tan and black mice, we can see that the tan mouse produced 11 pups and the tan and black mouse produced 3. And so that right there, you can say, well, this tan mouse is the fittest because it was able to produce the most offspring and passed on its genes to its offspring. Let's say if these mice were in this environment, let's say we talked about in a sandy environment, you can see why the black mouse would be easy to pick out in a sandy environment, why that mouse only lived 2 months, because it may have been eaten by predators. And the cream mouse as well, cream meaning like a more white color. Same thing, it's the opposite spectrum. When you got tan sand, the black mouse and the cream mouse are going to stand out, so they're not going to live very long because predators are more likely to pick them off. Okay, the tan and black both lived longer, but you can see the tan lived the longest. Therefore, because of its coat color, I said you could throw this out, but really we go back to this with the environment. The coat color kind of helped this mouse live 8 months as opposed to half the time for the tan and black, and therefore produce more offspring in that time. So the fittest mouse in the scenario is the tan mouse, all right? And it's the fittest because it produced the most offspring, all right? The reason it produced the most offspring was because it was blended in with the environment better, so it lived longer, okay? So just these are the kind of things that you want to keep in mind when you're looking at stuff like this. Now I'll let you, I've answered a couple of questions here, maybe 3. So I'll let you answer the rest of these, and you can turn this into me when you get done with it. All right. Now let me